Your great-grandfather understood something about money that you were never taught. He understood it the way people understand things they live through. Not from a book, not from a classroom, from watching the money in his county dry up. Not because the crops failed, not because business slowed, not because anything went wrong in his community, but because someone in Washington decided there was too much of it. And when he tried to do something about it, when he organized, voted, built a political movement, elected representatives, put over 1 million people behind a single idea, none of it appeared in your history book. The idea was not complicated. The government should create its own money. Lincoln proved it could be done. The men who came after him spent the next 50 years making sure it would never happen again. And the man who funded the schools that taught your grandfather's children made sure none of them would ever learn that it had. This is the history they left out. Before we get to what was taken, you need to understand what actually existed, because the history you were taught skips this part almost entirely. By 1861, the United States had operated without a central bank for nearly 30 years. Andrew Jackson had ended the Second Bank of the United States in 1833. For 3 decades, the country had financed itself without a permanent private banking institution controlling its currency. When the national crisis began in 1861, that arrangement was about to be tested. Abraham Lincoln needed money on a scale that had never been assembled in American history. The European banking houses, connected to the established financial networks of London and Paris, were perfectly willing to provide it, at 24 to 36% interest annually. Lincoln understood what those terms meant. He had studied what happened to governments that borrowed at those rates. A nation that financed its survival through private debt at 36% would emerge from that crisis permanently indebted to the houses that had lent it. The independence Americans had built over 80 years would transfer quietly, not through any vote, not through any public debate, through a loan agreement signed in desperation. He declined. Instead, Lincoln did something the banking establishment had spent decades trying to prevent any government from doing. He printed the money himself. In February 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. The Treasury issued $150 million in United States notes, not bonds, not borrowed currency, not debt instruments. Government money, printed directly, backed by the full faith of the United States, owed to nobody. People called them greenbacks because of the green ink printed on the back. By the end of the national crisis, nearly $450 million in greenbacks had been issued. And they worked. The government paid its soldiers, its suppliers, its contractors. Commerce continued across the North. The credit that ordinary Americans needed to plant crops, run businesses, and build communities did not dry up, because the money supply was not controlled by institutions that had any reason to contract it. The financial establishment noticed. The London Times, the voice of British banking interests, published an editorial in 1865 that is worth reading carefully today. It warned that if the American government could issue its own currency without borrowing from private banks, then other governments would follow. It called Lincoln's monetary approach more consequential than anything happening on any battlefield. It stated directly that the privilege of creating money must be restored to the banks, or the existing financial order would not survive. The London Times was not speaking about civilization. It was speaking about who controls the money supply. Sit with that for a moment. A newspaper owned by the British financial establishment called Lincoln's Currency, money printed by the American government owed to nobody, more dangerous than anything happening on any battlefield. Not because it would hurt ordinary people, because it would hurt the people who profit from lending money to governments. I want to ask you something before we continue. Did you learn in school that Lincoln printed government money during the national crisis? Yes or no? Leave it in the comments. Because your answer tells me something important about which version of this history you were given. Lincoln did not finish his second term, and 11 months after he was gone, Congress passed the law that began ending what he had built. His name was Hugh McCulloch, and the story of how he came to dismantle Lincoln's debt-free currency is one of the most revealing details in all of American monetary history. McCulloch had not come to Washington as a supporter of the national banking system. He had come specifically to fight against it. As president of the State Bank of Indiana, he had traveled to Washington in 1863 to oppose Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase's national banking plan. the system that had grown alongside Lincoln's greenbacks. Lincoln's Treasury Secretary persuaded him to run it instead. McCulloch accepted, and having spent years opposing the national banking system, he became its most aggressive advocate. In March 1865, McCulloch became Secretary of the Treasury. His first annual report, published in December of that year, did not leave his position ambiguous. He formally called for the retirement of all greenback currency and a return to gold. He stated that the resumption of gold payments was his primary aim. The argument he made was about inflation. The outcome he produced was something different. When a currency supply contracts, when the money circulating in an economy is deliberately reduced, prices fall. That sounds beneficial until you understand what it means for anyone who owes a debt. A farmer who borrowed $500 to plant his crop when $500 had a certain purchasing value now had to repay that same $500 in dollars that were worth more. His crop sold for less. His debt stayed the same. The gap between what he earned and what he owed widened, not because of anything he had done, but because the supply of money had been reduced by policy. The people who benefited from contraction were the people who held debt. The creditors, the banks, the financial institutions that were owed money in the new, more valuable dollars. The people who bore the cost were the people who owed it. In March 1866, Congress passed the Contraction Act, authorizing the withdrawal of $10 million in greenbacks within 6 months and $4 million per month thereafter. The House vote on the resolution authorizing McCulloch to begin contraction, 144-6. 144 members of Congress voted to begin withdrawing the debt-free currency from the communities that depended on it. 6 voted against. 144-6. I keep coming back to that number, not because of what the 144 did, because of what the 6 were willing to say out loud in a room where everyone else had already decided. If you have ever been in a situation, at work, in your community, anywhere, where you watched something clearly wrong happen and nearly everyone around you went along with it, you understand what those 6 votes represent. Tell me about it in the comments if you want, because I think the comments under this video might turn into something worth reading on their own. $44 million was successfully removed from circulation before a recession in 1867 made the human cost impossible for Congress to continue ignoring. In February 1868, Congress terminated the Contraction Act, but it did not restore the withdrawn money, and the direction of policy had been set. Here is the part of this history that should stop you. Because your great-grandfather did not accept what was being done to him quietly. He organized. The farmers and laborers who lived through the contraction of the late 1860s and 1870s understood precisely what had happened. They had watched money they depended on be deliberately withdrawn from their communities. They understood who had withdrawn it and why, and they built one of the largest third-party political movements in American history to stop it. The Greenback Party, formally established in 1875, had a platform that was specific and documented. The government should issue currency directly. The national banking system should be ended. Greenbacks should be full legal tender for all debts. The money supply should serve the communities that used it, not the financial institutions that controlled it. This was not a fringe position. By 1878, the Greenback movement had over 10,000 local clubs across the country. Farmers in Ohio, Indiana, Kansas, Iowa, and dozens of other states were meeting in churches, granges, and town halls to organize around a single documented argument: that the currency that had served them under Lincoln had been deliberately taken away, and that the men who took it away had done so to benefit creditors at the expense of everyone who owed them. In the 1878 midterm elections, the Greenback Party elected 22 members of the United States Congress. Read that again. 22 members of Congress, elected on a platform of government-created currency. In 1878, that is in the historical record of the United States House of Representatives. I have asked this question to a lot of people before making this video. People who read history, people who studied economics, people who follow politics closely. Not one of them knew it had happened. If you knew, tell me where you learned it. If you didn't, tell me that too. Because the distance between what is in that record and what gets taught is the whole story. And I think the comments here are going to prove it better than anything I could say. That is not a footnote. That is a documented political result that appears in the historical record of the United States House of Representatives. Your history teacher did not mention it. In 1880, the party ran James B. Weaver for president, a general from Iowa. He received 308,000 votes. That same year, the total Greenback movement had put over 1 million votes behind its candidates across state and congressional races. 1 million Americans, organized, voting, electing representatives, arguing in public in documented detail that what had been done to them was deliberate and that the government had the ability and the obligation to undo it. They were not heard. The Resumption Act of 1875, passed while the movement was still building, had already mandated that the Treasury redeem greenbacks in gold beginning January 1, 1879. By 1879, the gold standard was fully restored. The debt-free character of Lincoln's currency was gone. The Greenback Party ran one more presidential candidate in 1884. Then it dissolved. Its voters eventually moved into the Populist Party, the next attempt by ordinary Americans to reclaim what had been taken. That movement ran William Jennings Bryan for president in 1896 on a platform of silver coinage and monetary reform. Bryan lost, and 17 years later, the Federal Reserve was established. In December 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. It created a permanent central banking system for the United States. The first since Andrew Jackson had ended the Second Bank of the United States 80 years earlier. The Federal Reserve issued currency, but it did not issue it the way Lincoln had. Lincoln's greenbacks were created by the government directly, printed by the Treasury, owed to nobody, backed by the authority of the United States without any private institution standing between the government and the money supply. The Federal Reserve issued currency through private member banks. Currency entered circulation as debt, borrowed into existence through the banking system, carrying interest that flowed to private institutions. The arrangement that Lincoln had circumvented in 1862, the arrangement that 1 million Americans had organized to prevent from becoming permanent. It became permanent. The men most closely associated with the Federal Reserve Act's passage, Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., J.P. Morgan's representatives who met in private at Jekyll Island, Georgia in 1910 to draft the legislation, were the inheritors of the same financial network that had spent 50 years unwinding what Lincoln had built. The meeting at Jekyll Island is not a theory. It is documented in the memoirs of the participants. Senator Aldrich, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan and Company, and others traveled to the island in November 1910 under assumed names. They spent 9 days drafting the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act 3 years later. They were not meeting to help ordinary Americans create debt-free money. They were meeting to make sure that what Lincoln had done in 1862 would never be possible again. Here is what should make you pause. None of this is obscure. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 is a public document. The Contraction Act of 1866 is public law. The House vote of 144-6 is in the congressional record. The Greenback Party's election results, including the 22 members of Congress in 1878, are in the historical record. The London Times editorial is in that newspaper's archive. The memoirs of the Jekyll Island participants exist and have been published. Every piece of this history has been available for over a century, so why didn't your teacher explain it? In 1902, 36 years after the Contraction Act began withdrawing Lincoln's currency, John D. Rockefeller established the General Education Board. His family ultimately contributed $180 million to it. The board's function, documented in its own published reports, was to standardize American schooling. His advisor, Frederick Gates, wrote in 1906 that the aim of education was to produce in the child a perfect knowledge of what he ought to do and a will to do it. Not to ask who controls the money supply, not to understand that the government once created its own currency without borrowing it from anyone, not to know that 1 million Americans organized to restore that system, elected 22 members of Congress doing it, and that the financial establishment spent 50 years making sure they failed. The monetary history that explained what had happened to Lincoln's greenbacks, the same history that prairie farmers had understood well enough to build a national movement around. The same history that teachers like Edna Morse in Osage County, Kansas, were still teaching in 1901, the year she was let go, was not included in the standardized curriculum Rockefeller's money built. No dramatic removal, no public announcement. It was simply never added. By 1920, an American student could finish 12 years of school and never know that Lincoln had printed government money, never know it had been deliberately withdrawn, never know that 1 million Americans had spent a decade trying to bring it back, never understand that the Federal Reserve, the institution that controlled the currency they used every day, had been designed specifically to make sure none of that would ever be possible again. They were taught that the gold standard was stability, that the Federal Reserve was progress, that the banking system they lived inside was the natural result of sound economic management, not the outcome Lincoln had refused, not the system 1 million Americans had organized against, not the arrangement drafted in private on an island in Georgia by men who had every reason to make sure the history of what came before them would not be taught. The same man who funded the schools that erased this history was connected by family to the men who wrote the Federal Reserve Act. That is not a coincidence. That is a strategy. Your great-grandfather understood something about money that you were never taught. He may have been one of the 1 million Americans who voted Greenback in the 1870s. He may have stood in a church hall in Ohio or a grange in Kansas and listened to someone explain, in plain language, with documented evidence, exactly what the Contraction Act had done to his community and why. He was not wrong. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 is a public document. Lincoln signed it. The Treasury issued the money. The government paid its obligations without borrowing a single dollar from any private bank. The Contraction Act of 1866 is public law. Congress voted 144-6 to begin withdrawing that money. Hugh McCulloch's annual reports to Congress, available at the Treasury Department's own website, describe his intentions in his own words. The 22 members of Congress the Greenback Party elected in 1878 are in the historical record of the United States House of Representatives. All of it is there, in public archives, available to anyone who looks. Lincoln spent 1862 proving that a government could create its own money without borrowing it from private banks. The men who came after him spent the next 50 years proving that it would not be allowed to stand. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913. It has never issued a dollar that was not first borrowed into existence through the private banking system. What your great-grandfather fought for, in meeting halls, at ballot boxes, through the documented democratic process, was not restored. It was replaced with the arrangement that has been in place ever since. That is the history they left out, and now you have it.